So without further ado, let's get going because we do indeed have a very, very heavy 1 hour tonight. So much of what we have covered in the previous 3 sessions are really a build up to this final session on managing conflict. You know, like how we have always saying that love is really not quite enough to sustain relationships. So, but yet knowing how to top up our love tank, managing our expectations, and communicating better with our partner all help us to strengthen our ability to manage conflicts as a couple. So like I said, there's quite a bit to cover today, but much of it are actually established upon our earlier sessions. So I would be doing some quick recaps along the way here and now and then if needed. For any new friends who join us tonight, if you do need more clarifications online on any of the things that I mentioned, please feel free to email me to perhaps clarify some of the ideas that you may be interested to find out a little bit more. We will also be posting some of these related materials on our social media platform. So later on, before we end off tonight, I'll also be sharing with all of you our social media addresses so that you can stay tuned and actually keep in touch with us to find out what's to come along the way. Okay, so this is a very brief overview of what we are going to cover tonight. And first and foremost, we're going to start off with understanding conflict. I'm not too sure how many of you remember this diagram that I shared in our second sessions on managing relational conflict, relational expectation. If you do recall this diagram, we spoke about how two individuals coming together in a relationship brings along with them their own life experience, which very much shape their expectations when they go into a relationship with another person. Among them, there will be differences between individuals. Very often, these are where our conflicts sit between. When interactions are unfamiliar or incompatible, that can give rise to conflict. Actually, conflict by itself, in its purest form, if we refer to dictionary, it is actually a very neutral thing. Conflict essentially means a state of disagreement. What often happens when it comes to interacting with one another, particularly in a relationship that matters to us, is the impact of conflicts on people that very much influence how we respond to disagreement. Although over time, I have to admit that increasingly it was very heartening to hear more people saying that conflicts are inevitable. But very often, I still see people actually deeming conflicts as a detrimental and very undesired thing in their relationship. Some goes to the extent of actually trying to avoid conflict in a relationship as far as they possibly can. So, very often they see that conflict is one that hurts a relationship. What I'd like to propose tonight is that perhaps when conflicts are managed well, they do promote understanding and can strengthen the relationship. As we learn more about the different way of doing and thinking about things from our partner, we may actually be building both our strength as an individual and as a person, as a couple. So as usual, I think whatever that I'm sharing is something that I also, as far as possible, try to practice as an individual myself. So I do confess that honestly, I can be a very impatient person who can have very strong view. So I do go as far as admitting to that. But in my own relationship, right, over the years, I've also learned to embrace differences and be comfortable with things not being done the way I want them to. That has impact on not just the way that I deal with my romantic relationship with my partner, but also my other interpersonal relationships, such as at work. How do I interact with my colleagues, my other friends, etc. So, friends who have been with us since the first session, you know how much I love my love tank. A question for you to ponder at this very juncture is whether conflicts generally lead to cracks in your love tank, or do they actually fortify it? If overall they strengthen your relationship, would it necessarily be a very bad thing to have then? Okay, so would like to invite all of you to think about what is your relationship with conflict. Is this something that you actively avoid, or is this something that you actively actually use to strengthen your relationship? Last session, I shared very briefly that research has actually found that 69, a very, very high percentage, 69% of couples issues are what we will call perpetual issue. That's a big word. So what essentially perpetual issue means is that these are issues that cannot be resolved because fundamentally there are intrinsic differences between two individuals that cannot be compromised without losing too much of the core non-negotiables in each of our life. So 69% is a high percentage. I'm not quite sure if that's actually a good news or bad news. On the brighter side, I think how I tend to see is, well, if 69% of the issues are not general issues that can be resolved, maybe that gives hope that perhaps that's why there are times that being in a relationship, it can be challenging. So tonight, I would like to also invite you to think about the ideas of resolving conflicts versus managing conflicts. I think very often, right, when I see couple, they tend to come to me because they want to resolve a conflict. But does actually appreciating that most of our conflicts are perpetual issues, which means that they cannot be resolved, does it actually shapes how you look at conflict between you and your partner? Particularly when there are constant topics that got the two of you into arguments, if they cannot be resolved, can we actually look at managing them in a more constructive and less hurtful manner for our relationship? So, food for thought. Are you looking at managing it better, or are you looking at, I must resolve this conflict regardless? Okay. Before we get to talk about managing conflict as a whole, this next segment that I'd like to introduce all of you about this is actually quite generic. This is not something that's pertaining to only couple conflict. It is what I would call general conflict management style. It is important to know that among all of them, there is no best style per se. All of these styles have their utility. Having said that, there I would have to confess also that I do have my preference. I would say that there are indeed better and maybe not so great styles among them, especially if they're used as a default mode in conflict management. To understand conflict management style, I picked a relatively simple and hopefully easy to connect with model. This is actually the Thomas Kingman model of conflict management. Some of you might already be familiar with. That looks at two spectrums of importance. This is not math, but very quickly, I'm just going to introduce you to the x-axis and the y-axis, okay? So it's kind of on two domains. One look at the spectrum of importance of the y-axis, look at the importance of goals. That looks at the focusing on satisfying our personal needs as an individual in relation to the other person. And on the x-axis, it primarily focuses on relationship between two people, and that focus a lot in satisfying the other person's need. Maybe to help us to learn this particular model, perhaps let's see if we can try to give it a go. Okay, so you can see on my right hand side of my slides, I actually have 5 animals. I have my tortoise, I have my shark, my bear, teddy bear, my fox, and my owl. Let's give a little bit more interactive so that we could actually try to see in day-to-day life, can we connect to this particular model. So anyone want to give it a shot, you can type it in the group chat. If someone is generally avoidant, where the person places low emphasis on personal goal as well as relationship, among these 5 animals, right, what do you think? Which animal is probably most associated with an avoidant behavior? So if you could give some ideas in our group chat, let's see whether could you all connect to someone who is low on goals and low on needs, a very avoidant behavior. Okay, Joey and Agnes. Well, I think kind of the animal was a little clear, and both of you were right there that what we use to symbolize it tends to be a tortoise. I mean, we're not saying that the person is a tortoise or the person is a turtle. Let's not go back and say that Yening shared tonight that my partner is a turtle. Okay, that's not what I said. But these are really ways of helping us to remember what is a general tendency. So I want to give it one other shot. Okay, I mean, in view of time, let's try one more. Which animal would you probably associate with someone who's very high on wanting to achieve their goal and very low on placing emphasis on the relationship, satisfying the other person's need? So I have 4 animals left. I want to give you a shot in terms of which animal tends to have a competing nature. We have our owl. Is owl going to be someone who tends to compete? Our teddy bear, our fox, or our shark? Okay. Agnes, thank you very much for a response. So yes, indeed, someone who's actually really high on wanting to achieve the goal and low on relationship tends to have a characteristics of maybe a shark. Okay. So very quickly, the rest of the animals, a teddy bear tends to be reminding us of someone who's very accommodating, place a lot of emphasis on the relationship, a fox on compromising, and an owl on collaborating. What do they really mean? Very quickly, let me just run through them. I'm not going to spend too much time on these five styles because I think we could actually find a lot of all these informations online. I want to quite quickly bring them through to kind of have a flavor of what these styles mean, and I want to place a little bit more emphasis on managing conflict uh, going forward as a couple. So someone who tends to have an avoidant conflict management style, like I mentioned just now, there's very low emphasis on goals and needs of the other person. Very often also, we tend to see that someone who tends to take this approach in terms of resolving conflict, right? It sits between kind of a lose-lose situations where both parties actually probably walk out of that situation feeling that they can't get anything out of that particular management. Okay, one classic example of someone who tends to be taking an avoidance stand would be stonewalling. People who are here, audience who are here with us the last session, I spoke about stonewalling as a potentially a very detrimental way of communicating. It's really where you start not communicating with your partner. And one way of stonewalling is actually by working late through the week. When you know that there's a situation in the relationship, instead of attending to it, you spend a lot of time at work. Okay, so that's not quite a brilliant way of managing conflict. But having said that, I did actually mention just now that each style has its merit. When you know how to use it appropriately, they can actually be a very good way of managing conflict. I would actually say that if let's say you are actually trying to manage that conflict in the presence of your children, other family members, or even the members of public, you probably wouldn't want to raise your voice, and adopting an avoidance stand at that point in time actually can be a helpful stand to adopt at that point in time in terms of managing conflict. Okay, so let's take a look. The shark, a competing nature where there's very high focus on the goal. It tends to take a you lose, I win approach because I'm so bent on achieving my goal. So when it's not very helpfully used, it could be a situation where, for example, you insist that your partner visits your parents during CNY, Chinese New Year first, instead of the other party. Otherwise, you will not visit his at all. Okay, you could see that that's kind of like a I don't get what I want, you can forget about getting what you want. It's kind of you lose, I win kind of approach. Yet, you see, sounds very bad, right? I mean, competing, it carries a very strong connotation of, oh, that's rough, that's aggressive, that's like forcing things on me. But can it ever be helpful? It can be. Say you have a partner who actually really kind of play down on the health quite a bit. This is where if you do have a situation, instead of actually kind of like letting your partner be, if you actually realize that your partner is having severe pain, you're insistent at that point in time to bring your partner to the hospital. Yes, you are very assertive. You mean that now we go, now we go. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Potentially, I think that's a good thing. Okay, so as much as it might sound as though that this is a very aggressive stunt, but I do think that there are times that we need to be able to focus on the goal more than the relationship. After your partner attend to her health at that point in time, you can focus on actually reworking on the relationship. Okay, so that's our competing management style. Compromising. Okay, very often when I tell people fox represent compromising, people have a very negative connotation with fox. They think that it's very schemy, very cunning. But if you actually look at how fox works, right, they very often they may not get everything they want, but they make sure they take something back while leaving something with the other person. Okay, it tends to be kind of a you win, I win. They very strategically thinks, how can I get out of this situation with something that I want as well, even though I cannot get everything. A compromising stand looks a lot at finding middle ground. Okay, uh, it sounds like a good idea. Yeah, we often say give and take in relationship. I would say by and large, realistically speaking, that can be a helpful stand to take. However, in the long run, if it's always about finding middle grounds, we do run into the possibility of overlooking very important things. Because essentially, what we mean about finding overground is a middle ground is also talking about we are not getting all our needs met. And sometimes what I tend to see in couple in the long run, right, where they are very stuck in this stance, is that they start negotiating so much, barter trading so much that they end up in a situation where unless I get something out of our conflict management, otherwise you're not getting something as well. So you can see that sometimes it kind of go into that situation, which might not necessarily be helpful. But having said that, compromising, I would say by and large, can be helpful to move past in past, especially when sometimes your goals are really not that important. You really don't want to be tearing up one another's mood, one another's well-being because of that. For example, right, where to go for holidays. You could have many opportunities as a couple to go on holidays. Yeah. So do we need to fight and really pull our hairs out over every single holiday destination? Potentially, not necessarily. Maybe you want to consider compromising. Okay? Accommodating. This is where it tends to be situations where the relationship is way more important than the goal itself. It tends to be situations where someone actually focus so much on meeting the other person need that sometimes the personal goal are really placed at a very, very low. In fact, sometimes kind of like really negating, not putting the self-interest anywhere or okay. I would say that once again, I would like to emphasize that it's always both sides of the coin. A very accommodating conflict management style might not be very helpful, especially if you find yourself having to put up with very belittling statements and apologizing all the time because you value the relationship so much that you didn't want to hurt the relationship, even when the other person is constantly making you feel very small in that relationship. So I probably wouldn't think that that's a very helpful way of resolving conflict or managing conflict at large. How can it be helpful? It can be helpful if let's say you kind of like decides that your partner's birthday, you kind of want to make your partner feels like the prince or the princess and decide to accompany him or her to that concert, to that musical, even though maybe perhaps that's kind of not your cup of tea. So kind of you prioritize your partner's needs a little bit more than your own personal needs. That can be a positive and helpful way of looking on things. So the last conflict management style, we'll be looking at collaborative. That's where both of you, ours are always connected with a very wise person. So essentially, that's where people actually bring forth both their needs. They don't only talk about their needs; they also talk about their partner's needs. Come together, think about innovate a way that can meet both party needs. Ideal situation, win-win situation. I would say this is helpful very often. Perhaps this is kind of like the if I really have to say that the preferred way of conflict management, I'll say probably I lean towards that. But I also want to emphasize that a collaborative style, right, it's actually very takes a lot of effort and takes a lot of time. So that's probably not most helpful when you kind of are in a rush of time. You need to make a decision very quickly. You might not have the luxury of time. Yeah. So, and it may not also be very realistic. So you don't really actually want to end up really, for example, say tonight, you're just going to decide you can't you go into a conflict. One party wants Chinese for dinner, the other person wants Western. I'm really not too sure if you kind of want to spend an hour or two just understanding what's the other person's need and deciding to have Chinese or Western. Probably I think we could settle it way faster without having to discuss every single thing. Okay, so very quickly, that's the five conflict management style. I did mention at the start of the session that most couples are actually capable of resolving bits of their conflict. 69% are those that are much harder. So the good thing about that, right? You flip the other side, 100% minus 69, 31% of the issues faced by couples are primary solvable issues. For those 31%, I'd like to share something with you tonight that I have heard from a dear friend many, many years ago. What that got me really thinking about was really when we talk about a couple resolving conflict, right? Is that a good fight that we're putting up? Is this worth spending our time and effort fighting? Is this something that actually strengthen our love tank. So before you do fight, or even during or after you kind of finish a fight, I would like to invite all of you to think about whether that was a good fight by seeing if you can actually get 2 yeses in that particular fight. Okay, what do I mean by the 2 yeses? Let's take a look. First and foremost, this particular fight that you're going to have with your partner, this particular argument, if you were to embark on it, or if you're in the midst of it already, ask yourself, does it solve the problem that you are actually having between the two of you? Okay, so yes or no. If it is no, okay, so you're fighting and you realize after a while, particularly, especially you kind of get it after arguing for a while, you realize that you guys are getting nowhere. Then you have to think at that point in time, is it worth fighting over this, at least at this juncture, at this point in time? Is it worth fighting? Okay. If it's yes, great. You have your first yes, right? If fighting over this situation solve the conflict, talking about this situation solve the conflict, great. Second question that I'd like to invite all of you to think about is, does this fight, the way that you're fighting, at the way that you're doing it right now, does it bring the two of you closer? Does it bring the two of you closer in the relationship? Remember at the start when I spoke about conflict, if conflict are fought well, it actually can enhance relationship. Okay. If it's no, once again, okay, you kind of won the fight, but it actually didn't bring the two of you closer. If anything, it leaves a crack in your love tank. Once again, I would like to invite yourself, is it worth continuing the fight over there? Okay. But if it's a yes, kind of like with the fight that you had with your partner over that situation, you kind of realize you found out more about your partner. You kind of realize that the two of you could work on the situation a lot better, and it really enhanced that relationship amidst that maybe heated argument there and then. Great for you. I hope from the last session you kind of did actually manage to use the antidotes of the 4 horsemen rather than the 4 horsemen itself. Okay. So for those 31% or even 100% of the conflict management, I would like to encourage you to strive towards the 2 yeses to these 2 very important questions. Once again, does it solve the problem? And secondly, does it bring the two of you closer? Okay. Say, that's 31%. Most couple don't go to a therapist for it because most of the time they kind of can resolve it themselves. What about the other 69% then? If they cannot be resolved, how can we manage it better? How can we work through this gridlock that we constantly have? Okay. So remember, this was something that I'm not going to go through all of it, but I kind of talked about it the previous session about good communication. Remember the principle of leap. 69% of the issues, very often, they are not easy to talk about issues. So this is where I would strongly encourage you to, even before you kind of go into the conflict management, remember to set the environment, create the environment to have conversations which are generally difficult to have. So remember to listen to understand, promote the emotional safety between the two of you, agree to disagree, and pace. So I won't go so much into that. I think we had upload our previous session on our Facebook page. So feel free to take a look at it if you need some recapping, or if this is new for you, you can actually hear a little bit more about it in the previous session. Okay, so in terms of that 69% of perpetual issue, so I keep saying perpetual issue, talking about fundamental difference. What exactly is perpetual issue? These are actually fundamental differences in our personality, our lifestyle, our values, etc. If you observe, if you do remember the earlier bit where I was showing that whole overlapping circle, that blue zone are essentially a lot of perpetual issues that we're dealing with. We might necessarily not get to a resolution to all those circumstances. One very typical characteristics, if you're wondering what are perpetual issue, I think I would like to encourage to say that in terms of resolving all these deep-rooted issues, the first and foremost is to realize their existence. How do you identify them? One way to identify them is you realize there are certain things in your relationship that you keep coming to. You may be arguing about different components of it, but you find that it's always about the same thing. Say, for example, it's always about the household chores. It's always about the socks, the cups, the dishes, the laundries, etc. So it could be about different things, but it's always about household chores. So potentially that is a sign to tell you that when it comes to distribution of household chores or managing of household chores, that's a common issue between you and your partner. Okay, so we talk about perpetual issues. It sounds like a lot, but by and large, right, there are very common themes in couples. Anyone wants to give it a guess? What are the top five very, very common issues that comes up in couple? I kind of spilled the bean a little bit. In my work with couples, and even research has shown that very often household chores is one thing that couple are constantly fighting over. It can be going from as small as the socks to as big as why is it that I'm always the person doing it. Okay, so Sandra, wow, ding ding ding, money. Yes, yes, financial is one common things that we tend to see in couple. That's one. So that's the second thing already. Joy, children. Yep. Children is a bit interesting because not all couples have children. But yes, in fact, if I would extend it a little bit, children tends to be the top six issues that couple tends to experience. Parenting specifically. Yeah, parenting. Sandra, thank you very much. Parenting. So, um, so we have household chores, um, we have parenting, we have financial. JZ, yes, habits. Habits kind of fall into our category, our fourth category, which is our patterns, our leisure activities, our social interaction patterns. You know, habits, for example, that's very much linked to, for example, things like how do you do things? Say, are you extroverted? Are you introverted? Yeah. Sandra, you mentioned religion. I might subsume religion under the social activity, leisure activities. I think that falls into some of the do we go to church? Do we not go to church? Do we what faith we have, etc. Joey, Joey, extended family. Yes, you kind of. Where am I? I lost count a little bit. Okay, we have five already. Actually, there's one more. One more. I do not know if anyone is thinking of that. Yeah. Hannah, you talk about personal career and hobbies. Yes, that falls under probably our leisure activity. The very last one that couple actually very often fight over. And I would have to say that that's not a common topic, but that is something that I do observe very much. In fact, I very often explore with couple when they start fighting, when the relationship is not in a good place. That's usually one of the first thing that I see going amiss, and that is physical intimacy. Yeah, because after all, when we are really fighting fiercely, right? Most people says no, I don't want to get close to you physically. Yeah, and that's not just sex as usual. That's even I don't even want to hug you. Okay, so physical intimacy also tends to be something that couple fight a lot because sex is indeed something that's very common in couple. That's natural, that is usual, but that's a very difficult topic to talk about even in couples. So that sixth thing forms the top six issues. Huh? So these are the perpetual issues. Are they also things that you experience in your relationship? Would like you to invite you to think about. And if you keep fighting over it, is it because fundamentally you and your partner have very different way of looking at that? Good start. Thank you very much for your participations, all of you. You kind of achieved the very first step of managing conflict. First and foremost, know where are the fundamental difference in your relationship.